They thought they could get away with secretly rerouting my power line to fuel their luxury clubhouse until I flipped the master switch and left the entire HOA shivering in the dark, begging for mercy. I moved to Cedar Pines for peace. That's all I ever wanted. After 10 years of handling emergency response contracts for disaster zones, I was burned out. Fires, floods, power grid collapses, seen it all. So when I found this quiet lakefront home tucked into the woods outside town, I knew it was exactly what I needed. Secluded, serene, surrounded by old-growth trees, fresh air, and the distant calls of loons over the water. The neighborhood was part of an HOA, but they pitched it as light-touch management and just to keep things beautiful. I didn't think much of it. I paid the dues, signed the welcome packet, and focused on making the place my sanctuary for the first 2 months. Life was everything I had hoped for. My mornings started with fresh coffee on the deck, watching the mist rise from the lake. I spent my afternoons fixing up the place, adding new insulation, solar backup systems, a smart thermostat, and even a small greenhouse out back at night. I read in silence or worked on woodworking projects in the garage. I barely interacted with anyone, and honestly, that was the goal. Occasionally, someone from the HOA would send out newsletters or invite me to some event at the clubhouse, but I politely declined every time. I wasn't rude, I just didn't want to get involved in their wine nights, bake sales, or book clubs. Then the first electric bill arrived. I remember standing at my kitchen counter, flipping through the envelope with a puzzled look. The paper felt heavier than usual. When I unfolded it, my jaw tightened. $5,733.82. My last bill, just a month earlier, had been $118. I stared at the numbers again. Surely it had to be a typo. I pulled out my calculator, checked my meter, and ran some estimates. It didn't add up. Even if I ran my HVAC 24/7 and had 10 people living with me, I couldn't burn through that much electricity. Something was off, very off. I called the utility company after a long hold and some back and forth with a rep who sounded like he was barely awake. He confirmed the usage was real. "You're pulling a ton of power from that address, sir. It could be faulty equipment," he said casually. I asked for a breakdown. He emailed me usage logs, and sure enough, the spike had begun 3 weeks ago. Every evening between 5:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., my power draw would shoot through the roof. It was as if someone was running a laundromat, an industrial kitchen, and a swimming pool pump all at the same time. At first I thought maybe one of my systems had a short or misfiring relay, so I went into full diagnostic mode. I ran full power checks on my HVAC water heater, solar controller, and even the basement freezer. Everything came back clean. I reset breakers, monitored power draw from each circuit, and even turned everything off one night just to check. The weirdest thing, even with everything shut down, my smart meter still showed usage. High usage. That made no sense. That's when I noticed something strange in the backyard near the tree line where I had a buried conduit running toward the rear utility panel. The soil looked disturbed, just slightly. You wouldn't notice it unless you had spent enough time around job sites. The grass was laid too neatly. A shallow line stretched from the corner of my lot and disappeared into the woods. I crouched down, brushed some of the soil aside, and saw what I feared: a splice junction. Whoever had done it was sloppy. I dug a little deeper. There, beneath just a few inches of dirt, was a tapped power line. They had run a heavy-duty cable from my panel, split the insulation, and redirected current into a secondary line heading out of my property. And judging by the direction, it wasn't going to another house, it was going to the HOA clubhouse. I didn't say a word to anyone, not yet. I needed proof. For the next few days, I set up a covert monitoring system. I placed a clamp meter around the main line that fed the suspected tap and paired it with a data logger. Every evening, without fail, the numbers spiked. On Friday night, the load hit a peak so high it could have powered for homes. I checked the HOA calendar. They were hosting a private event at the clubhouse, some kind of board appreciation dinner. I laughed to myself. Board appreciation? My dimed out now. I'm not the kind of guy who runs straight to a lawyer. I've worked with enough systems to know that sometimes revenge is best served. Smart. Reporting it to the electric company might get me refunded eventually, but HOA boards have a way of twisting things. They'd claim confusion, miscommunication, or that it was accidental. They'd tie it up in committees and legal motions until it became my headache. No, I needed something better. So I went quiet. I let the next bill come, and it was just as outrageous. My bank account was groaning, but I had a plan. In the meantime, I installed a few upgrades of my own. I rerouted my main panel through a manually controlled bypass breaker that I placed in a hidden enclosure in my garage wall, something I could switch off at any time without anyone knowing. I also double-checked the clubhouse layout. Power flowed straight from their back wall conduit into the main building. No other line, no backup. The final piece was timing. I waited for their biggest event of the season, an outdoor movie night, with live jazz, food trucks, and lights everywhere. They promoted it for weeks. HOA Summer Bash, brought to you by your community board. Posters were stapled to every mailbox. They even had a bouncy castle for kids. Perfect. As the sun dipped behind the trees that night, and the crowd gathered under the string lights, I flipped my hidden switch. Within seconds, everything went black. Not a flicker, not a slow fade, just a clean, instant shutdown. No music, no lights, no fans. I heard the loud hump of the bouncy castle collapsing, and a collective scream as dozens of people found themselves suddenly in the dark. Confusion swept through the event like wildfire. I leaned against my porch railing, sipping lemonade, watching from a safe distance through the trees. Phones lit up, people shouted, flashlights came out. One board member ran toward the clubhouse in a panic, trying to reset breakers, but nothing happened. That was the beauty of it. When the source is cut off at the root, no switch can bring it back. They were stranded. I just stood there smiling, listening to their confusion echo across the lake. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Jenna. From the board, I let it go to voicemail. Then the calls came faster from Mark, then Tanya, then some unknown number I assumed was their maintenance guy. Finally, I picked up on the fourth ring. "Hey, is your power out too?" Mark asked, sounding sweaty and out of breath. "Nope," I said casually. "Everything's running fine here. Must be isolated. But we think it might be your line. It's affecting the whole clubhouse," he stammered. I paused, letting the silence grow heavy. "Interesting," I said slowly, "because you've been pulling power off my line for a month now. Didn't think I'd notice there was silence on the other end." Heavy breathing, Mark. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, voice cracking. "Then I suggest you walk behind the clubhouse. Open your main panel and look at where the conduit comes from. Then call your lawyer." And I hung up. That was just the beginning. Mark didn't call back. Not that night, and not the next day either. But I knew he would eventually. When people are caught red-handed and don't have a good excuse, they usually try one of two things: denial or damage control. I figured Mark and the rest of the HOA board were too arrogant for denial, but not smart enough for damage control. For now, they would sit tight, try to fix the clubhouse power, and hope I wouldn't say anything more. But I wasn't done. I spent the next morning organizing all the evidence I had been collecting. Every photo of the spliced line, every clamp meter reading, every video clip from the backyard security cameras I had installed once I noticed the trench. I printed everything, highlighted timestamps, and compiled a neat digital folder. I made 3 copies, one for myself, one on a cloud backup, and one on a flash drive I kept in my truck's glove compartment. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about leverage. That same day, a local electrician came to the clubhouse in a marked van. I recognized the name Tanner & Sons Electric. They were legit. The HOA must have called them in, probably hoping they could fix the issue quickly before anyone else found out what had happened. I watched from across the lake as 2 guys walked around the building, gesturing toward the power conduit behind the clubhouse. One of them knelt down and opened the box, the same one that had been illegally connected to my line. I could practically see the confusion on their faces. The power was dead, and no one knew why except me. They must have realized pretty quickly that the clubhouse had no legal feed of its own. I smiled as they scratched their heads, looked around nervously, then packed up and left without touching a thing. That confirmed it. The HOA hadn't just tapped into my line, they had entirely depended on it. I had unknowingly powered their whole building for weeks. They had no clue how to reconnect legally without a complete rewiring job, and that wasn't going to be cheap. Later that afternoon, I finally received a knock on my door. It was Tanya, another board member, always the one trying to play a good cop. She was in her early 40s, wore a sharp navy blue blouse and a pair of oversized sunglasses. Probably hoping to disguise the fact that she'd barely slept. "Hi there," she said, smiling tightly. "Got a minute?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Sure, this about your clubhouse." She hesitated. "We might have had an issue with the power. We're still investigating. Just trying to figure out where things went wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that right? Because from what I saw, things went wrong about 20 feet into my backyard." She chuckled nervously. "Look, there might have been a mix-up with the previous contractor, a misunderstanding with the utilities. Those things happen." I folded my arms. "A misunderstanding that involved trenching into my land, slicing into my power line, and stealing thousands of dollars of electricity. That's more than a mix-up, Tanya." Her face fell. Okay, I'm not here to fight. We just want to fix this. Quietly, no lawsuits, no headaches. Maybe we can work something out." There it was, damage control. I let the silence hang for a few seconds, watching her squirm. "What do you have in mind?" I asked, not because I was interested, but because I wanted to hear just how desperate they were. She glanced around, lowered her voice. "We'll reimburse you, fully, and maybe offer you a small bonus. A disruption fee, if you will. In exchange, we hope you won't escalate this." "You mean report it?" She gave a small nod. I sighed, then stepped back into the house. Returned a moment later with a manila folder and handed it to her. "Everything's in there: meter data, timestamps, video stills, and a written statement I've already submitted to my lawyer. If this doesn't get resolved properly, it goes to the utility company, the county code enforcement office, and local news. Tanya opened the folder and skimmed through the top few pages. I could see the blood drain from her face. I'd suggest you talk to the rest of the board, I continued. And fast. She nodded silently, then turned and walked back to her golf cart. The folder clutched to her chest like it weighed 100 pounds. That evening, the board held a private meeting. Not at the clubhouse. Of course, Sid still had no power. They gathered at Mark's house, probably hoping to craft some kind of strategy. I wasn't invited, but I knew exactly what they were discussing. I imagined the panic, the blame shifting, the spreadsheets, the desperate phone calls to lawyers. I wasn't worried. I had them boxed in, and they knew it. The next morning, I got an email formally written, with an attached letter bearing the HOA seal. It was an apology, though it read more like a legal disclaimer. They admitted that a contractor working without full oversight had accidentally rerouted power from my property, and that they regret any unintentional impact on residents. At the end, they offered to reimburse the full electric overage and proposed a $3,000 goodwill bonus if I would agree not to pursue legal action or speak publicly about the incident. I chuckled and closed the laptop that afternoon. I drafted my reply. I accepted the reimbursement. They owed me that much and more. But I declined the hush money. Instead, I proposed a different resolution. The board would resign immediately. They would hold a special vote to replace themselves with members from the wider community, people who had no part in this theft. And they would submit to an independent audit of the HOA's finances from the past year. No audit, no peace. I hit send. They must have panicked. By that evening, 3 board members had stepped down. Mark, Tanya, and a third guy named Derek all submitted resignations. The next newsletter from the HOA announced exciting changes in leadership and a renewed focus on transparency. I could have laughed out loud. They were trying to spin it like they weren't just caught robbing one of their own residents. What they didn't know was that word was already spreading. A neighbor named Jerry, 2 houses down, came over the next morning. He was in his 60s, wore jeans and a faded fishing shirt, and had the kind of permanent squint you get from working outside your whole life. "Hey," he said, leaning on the railing. "Heard you had a little power issue?" I nodded. "You could say that." He looked around, made sure no one else was listening. "You're not the first, you know. They pulled a similar trick with the irrigation lines last year. Rerouted some water pipes to run sprinklers on HOA property. Said it was a maintenance error." I frowned. "Did you report it?" "Nah, didn't have proof. They always covered their tracks. But it cost me over $1,000 in water bills," I whistled. "Well, this time they didn't cover anything." Jerry grinned. Good about time someone stood up to them. Over the next week, more people came forward. A couple down the street had noticed odd charges on their landscaping bills. A retiree said he was threatened with fines for a satellite dish he never installed. Slowly, a pattern emerged. This HOA had been manipulating homeowners, cutting corners, and covering it up for years. And now, thanks to their greed and one badly buried power cable, they were finally being exposed. And I wasn't done yet. I scheduled a meeting with the utility company's fraud department. I wanted an official investigation. The stolen power wasn't just theft, it was a safety hazard. The spliced cable could have caused a fire, or worse. I handed them all my documentation, answered their questions, and gave them access to the site. The field rep they sent out took one look at the splice and muttered, "Yeah, someone's in deep trouble." That was music to my ears. By the time the week ended, the HOA had been hit with a formal complaint, an internal audit had begun, and a new temporary board was forming. And me, I went back to my peaceful mornings and my silent nights, only now with a new sense of control. I wasn't just the guy in the lake house anymore. I was the one who flipped the switch and reminded them who really held the power. Literally. The power stayed off at the clubhouse for 10 more days. During that time, I watched the HOA unravel in real time. What was once a smug, self-congratulatory board of suburban monarchs had become a twitchy, disbanded mess, with 3 of the board members resigned and the 4th suspiciously on vacation. No one was left to organize the community newsletter, enforce lawn citations, or bark about mailbox paint colors. I couldn't have been happier. My front yard had never looked more peaceful. But behind the calm, I knew there was more to this story, something deeper than just stolen electricity. Why would they risk tapping into my power line for weeks instead of just paying to upgrade their own system? It didn't make sense unless they couldn't afford it. That's when I decided to dig into the HOA's finances. Now, HOA budgets aren't usually public record, but I had a little help. Remember Jerry, the neighbor with the squint and fishing shirt? Turns out he used to be an accountant before retirement. When I mentioned I suspected the board had misused community funds, he lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh, I'd love to look into their books," he said, cracking his knuckles like a man about to polish off a long-lost hobby. So we teamed up over the next week. Jerry helped me request copies of past budgets, receipts, and invoices from the HOA's treasurer who, thanks to the ongoing investigation, was suddenly very cooperative. At first we got vague answers. "The files are being updated. We're conducting a review. Let's wait for the new board to settle in." But Jerry wasn't the kind of guy you could put off easily. He filed a formal demand under the HOA bylaws, and within 48 hours a Dropbox folder appeared in his inbox, full of scanned documents and Excel sheets. We started going through them that night in Jerry's garage, surrounded by fishing poles, toolboxes, and the smell of motor oil. Jerry pulled out a folding table, laid out the papers, and opened his laptop. "This one's from last quarter," he said, pointing at a spreadsheet labeled Q2 General Maintenance. "They logged over $14,000 for electrical work." I blinked. 14 grand. That's not what Tanner & Sons charges. They quoted me $6,800 for a full clubhouse rewiring. "Exactly," Jerry said, flipping through a folder. "And look here to payments to Sunshine Electric for $7,200 each. Same company. Nope, different names, different bank accounts." My stomach twisted. Shell companies. Could be, he nodded, or someone's brother-in-law cashing checks. We dug deeper. Over the next 3 hours we found similar discrepancies, duplicate payments, vague consulting fees, landscaping expenses that didn't line up with actual work performed, and most suspicious of all, a recurring $950 monthly charge, listed under special projects. There was no breakdown, no receipts, nothing to show where it went. It was just there, every month, siphoning money. Jerry leaned back in his chair, arms folded. They were bleeding the community dry, and when they ran out of budget, I added, they turned to my power line. He nodded grimly. "It all fits." I left Jerry's garage that night with a folder full of printed evidence and a new understanding of how deep the rot had gone. The HOA hadn't just stolen from me, they'd been stealing from everyone for over a year, hiding it in plain sight behind bureaucratic language and false invoices. Now, I had the proof. The next day, I made an appointment with the county fraud investigator assigned to the HOA's complaint. Her name was Dana, and she was no nonsense from the second I walked in. Late 40s, sharp eyes, wore a navy blazer and carried a yellow legal pad like a weapon. "What do you have for me?" she asked, sliding her glasses down her nose. I laid out the folder, the flash drive, and a summary sheet Jerry had helped me draft. She flipped through it in silence for 5 minutes, nodding occasionally, raising an eyebrow once or twice. Then, she looked up. "This is good. Very good." "So, what happens next?" I asked. "We already had enough to pursue criminal charges for utility theft," she replied, "but this." She tapped the sheet. "This is financial fraud, embezzlement, possibly racketeering. If we can connect these shell companies to board members or their relatives, this could escalate fast." I leaned back, satisfied. "I'd be happy to testify if it comes to that." "I might take you up on that," she said, smiling faintly. By the time I left the county office, the wheels were already turning. That evening, uniformed investigators showed up at Mark's house with a warrant. Neighbors gathered on porches, trying to pretend they weren't watching, but nobody could look away. Mark stood on his porch in gym shorts and a wrinkled polo shirt, trying to act casual as they boxed up files, hauled out his desktop computer, and drove away with 2 full black crates of evidence. I didn't feel bad, not even a little, but what I didn't expect was how the rest of the neighborhood reacted. At first, people were cautious. I was still the guy who shut off the power. But then, they started approaching me at the mailbox, in their yards, even while I walked my dog. They didn't come to complain, they came to say thank you. Turns out, most of them had been quietly frustrated with the board for years but never knew how to fight back. They'd been fined for stupid things: faded window shutters, non-standard flower pots, leaving trash cans out for 30 extra minutes. And all the while the board had been living large off their dues. One woman, Linda, nearly hugged me right there on the sidewalk. "You're the reason my daughter's music lessons didn't get cancelled," she said. "They were about to raise dues again. We couldn't afford it." I smiled, surprised. "Just doing what needed to be done." "No," she said. "You did what no one else could." With the board dismantled, a special election was held. The turnout was the biggest in HOA history. Jerry ran for treasurer and won in a landslide. Linda joined as secretary. A retired police officer volunteered for compliance, and a quiet, middle-aged woman named Rosa took over as president. I didn't run for anything, despite multiple people asking me to. I just wanted to be left alone again, but in a community that was finally being honest. The new board made quick changes. They opened all finances to public inspection. They held open meetings. They launched a community website where residents could track where every dollar went. They even refunded overcharged fines and canceled pending ones. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to speak up. As for me, I installed a new reinforced power meter and added security cameras to every corner of my property. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew better now. Peace, as I had learned, wasn't about isolation, it was about balance, about having your boundaries respected and standing your ground when they weren't. 1 week after the new board took office, I received an official letter from the HOA, not a fine, not a threat, a thank you card. Inside was a handwritten message. "From Rosa, you didn't just restore the power, you restored trust. We'll take it from here, and if you ever do want to join the board, we'd be honored." I smiled and tucked the card into a drawer. I didn't need a seat at their table. I had my peace and I had my power. For a while, things were calm. The new HOA board did everything right. Meetings were transparent, community events were optional, and nobody got harassed about the height of their grass or the color of their door wreath. Jerry kept the books cleaner than a hospital floor, and Rosa ran the meetings with fairness and a nonsense tone that made even the grumpiest residents sit up straight. The clubhouse got rewired legally this time and I was fully reimbursed for the electricity they stole. I had no complaints. But peace doesn't always last. Not when pride, power, and money are involved. 2 months after the board change, I noticed something odd. It started with a strange truck parked near the end of my road, not in a driveway, just idling near the woods. At first I thought it was someone lost or waiting on a delivery. But then I saw the same truck again the next morning, and again a few days later. Always a different time, always the same spot. A black Dodge Ram, no plates on the front, dark tinted windows. I didn't like it. I mentioned it to Jerry, and he raised his brow. "That sounds familiar," he said, stroking his chin. "There used to be a guy in a black truck who hung around the HOA office last year, before the election. Claimed he was doing work for the board, but no one ever saw him doing anything. Think they're watching us?" I asked, half-joking. Jerry gave me a look that wasn't a joke. Wouldn't surprise me. I shrugged it off at the time, but in the back of my mind, a little alarm went off. A few days later, my backyard motion sensor went off in the middle of the night. I live in a wooded area, so I get the occasional deer or raccoon wandering through. But this time, it was different. The camera caught someone walking along my fence line. They stayed in the shadows, never came too close, and didn't do anything outright illegal, but they were clearly watching my property. I couldn't see their face, but they were tall, wearing a hoodie and work boots. They stood there for almost 5 full minutes, just looking. I called the sheriff's department the next morning and filed a report. They couldn't do much, without a clear ID or a crime committed, but they agreed to send a cruiser through the area a few times a week. It made me feel a little better, but not much. The next week, Rosa stopped by my house unannounced. She looked tense. "I wanted to let you know something," she said, wringing her hands. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for bad news. "Someone filed a formal complaint against you. Claims you installed unauthorized surveillance equipment in a common area and tapped into HOA property lines." I blinked. "What?" "I know it's false," she said quickly. "But we have to respond officially. It was submitted anonymously. Could be retaliation from the old board, or someone connected to them." I let out a dry laugh. "They're accusing me of stealing power now," she sighed. "It's ridiculous. But protocol says we have to investigate. Jerry and I will review everything and clear your name, but I wanted to give you a heads up before you heard about it from anyone else." I appreciated that, but something about it felt bigger. Petty complaints were one thing, this was something more. Whoever filed it wanted to discredit me, to flip the narrative. They couldn't undo the damage I'd done to the old board's reputation, but they could try to muddy the waters. I sat with it for a while, thought it through. Then it hit me. Mark. He had disappeared after the investigation. Rumors swirled that he left town or fled to avoid charges. But what if he hadn't? What if he was still nearby, hiding behind someone else, pulling strings quietly? After all, people like him didn't go down easy. They fought in the shadows when they lost in the light. I shared the theory with Jerry, who nodded slowly. "You might be right," he said. "We should dig deeper." So we did. Jerry and I started going back through the vendor logs. We focused on names we hadn't looked into yet, especially Sunshine Electric, the one that overbilled for phantom electrical work. We did a business lookup and found it was registered to a P.O. box in a nearby town. No office, no website, no phone listing. That was suspicious enough, but then we traced the bank account listed on one of the scanned invoices and found something worse. It was linked to a trust owned by Mark's cousin. Bingo. It wasn't direct proof, but it was enough to establish a connection. Mark had created a fake vendor through a relative, funneled HOA funds into it, and pocketed the cash. That's why he had no problem using my power. He wasn't trying to save the HOA money. He was trying to stretch every stolen dollar by avoiding real expenses. We took the info straight to Dana, the fraud investigator. She didn't say much, just gave a sharp nod and told us, "Good work, we'll take it from here." By now, I had resecured every inch of my property: motion lights, reinforced locks, tamper-proof cable casings, and backup cameras that stored to a cloud server overseas. If someone wanted to try anything again, I'd know about it instantly. Then, just when I thought things might calm down, it all exploded. One Thursday morning, I woke to the sound of sirens. 2 county sheriff SUVs pulling into the old HOA office. It wasn't even being used anymore, but someone had broken in during the night, not to steal, to destroy. The place had been gutted, cabinets yanked open, hard drives smashed, old financial records shredded and scattered like confetti. The locks had been drilled out. The windows were broken and spray painted on the wall. In red letters, "You think you won." The message wasn't meant for the HOA, it was meant for me. And I knew then that Mark wasn't just bitter, He was angry, desperate, maybe even dangerous. But what he didn't understand was that I didn't scare easily. Not after the things I've seen in disaster zones. Not after dealing with manipulative HOA board members who thought they could drain people dry and walk away clean. I called Dana and told her everything. She said the break-in confirmed their suspicions and escalated the case. A warrant was already out for Mark's arrest, and they believed he was still in the area. They suspected he'd been using a fake name and hiding out with extended family. Walls were closing in. Later that week, Jerry and I installed one more camera pointed directly at the clubhouse parking lot, just in case. I also kept my phone fully charged and my truck backed in with the keys ready. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Because people like Mark, they don't go down without one last swing, and I had the feeling he wasn't finished yet. It didn't take long after the clubhouse break-in for everything to unravel. 3 days later, an unmarked sheriff's vehicle rolled quietly through the neighborhood just after sunrise. They didn't use sirens or lights. They didn't want to tip him off, but their timing couldn't have been more perfect. Mark had just stepped out the back door of a small gray house at the edge of the development, carrying a duffel bag. He didn't make it past the mailbox. 3 plainclothes deputies swarmed him before his coffee cup hit the ground. No fight, no chase. He froze. Maybe he finally realized the game was over. Word spread fast. By noon, every neighbor with a porch chair in a group chat knew. Mark had been living 2 blocks away the entire time under a fake name, property owned by his sister-in-law, barely even disguising himself. He'd been working odd jobs off the books, tracking anyone who spoke against him and sending anonymous threats to members of the new board. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated how tight the neighborhood had become. When the new HOA board stepped in, people stopped being afraid. We looked out for each other again. We shared footage, talked at town halls, and actually listened when someone said they felt unsafe. The residents didn't just replace the corrupt, they rebuilt trust. That's what Mark couldn't stand. That was his downfall. A week after the arrest, I was called to testify. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Mark sat at the defendant's table, hands folded, a blank look on his face. He didn't glance at me once, not when I was sworn in, not when I detailed how he'd stolen power from my private meter, not when I explained how he created fake vendors and laundered HOA money through shell companies. The DA didn't need to stretch the truth. They had the emails, they had the bank records, they had the hardware from the clubhouse he destroyed with his own hands. In the end, the judge called it exactly what it was: premeditated fraud, abuse of power, criminal mischief, and malicious harassment. Mark was sentenced to 8 years. That night, the board hosted a community cookout. Burgers, music, even a bounce house for the kids, for the first time in what felt like forever. People were laughing again, relaxed. Jerry grilled. Rosa handed out lemonade, and neighbors who once only waved from their driveways now sat around picnic tables sharing stories. I stood by the edge of the yard, paper plate in hand, watching it all. Rosa came up beside me and smiled. "Do you ever think it'd end like this?" "Honestly," I said, "no, but I'm glad it did." She raised her cup to turning the lights back on. We clinked cups. The next morning, I decided it was time to finish what I started. I drove up to the old electric meter the HOA had tampered with. It was still there, sealed off now, with a bright yellow sticker that read, "Do not tamper." County monitored. A little overkill maybe, but satisfying nonetheless. Then I went home and pulled out the box. Inside were the last remaining pieces of the old ordeal, photocopies of the forged invoices, a broken smart plug they'd hacked, even the letter where they blamed me for overusing power. I sifted through it all, one piece at a time, then fed each item into my shredder. I wasn't keeping trophies. I was clearing space, because that chapter, it was done. From then on, I put my focus where it mattered: fixing up the house, hosting barbecues, and helping Jerry draft clearer HOA policies that protected owners, not punished them. I even volunteered to lead a workshop for new residents about their rights under HOA rules. If I could stop even one neighbor from getting blindsided like I had, it was worth it. And wouldn't you know it, the electric bill never spiked again. Turns too well when people stop siphoning your power. Your home runs just fine. A few months later, I was out trimming hedges when a new couple pulled up in a U-Haul across the street. Young, smiling, wide-eyed like all first-time homeowners. The husband waved awkwardly, looking unsure. "You live here long?" he asked. I smiled. "Long enough." "Is the HOA, Yano, okay?" I leaned on my rake and laughed. "They used to be the worst, but now you're in good hands." He looked relieved. "That's good to know." "My last neighborhood, the HOA fined me for having a crooked mailbox." I chuckled. "Yeah, ours tried to fine me $5,000 for electricity I didn't use." His jaw dropped. "What?" How I wiped my brow. "That," I said, "is a story. Maybe I'll tell you someday." And just like that, the neighborhood kept moving forward. People came and went. Grass grew, leaves fell, life rolled on. And the darkness that had tried to creep into our quiet corner of the world, it stayed gone, because the power wasn't just in the wires, it was in the people who finally stood up and said, "No more." Like real justice stories that leave you speechless. Then don't miss more dramatic true life tales on Bright Reality. Like, comment, share, and subscribe now for more.